Before we launch into part 3 of this wonderful episode with Geoffrey West, I want to thank our sponsor, Zai, boldly transforming the future of financial services with a suite of embedded finance products and services, empowering businesses to manage multiple payment workflows and move funds with ease. You can check out Zai at hellozai.com. Let's get into part 3 of Scale with Geoffrey West. Geoffrey West, welcome back. It's so great to have you back.
Hey, Aidan, nice to be back. And thank you once again for inviting me. I'm very much looking forward to the continuation of our conversation.
You're going to be sick of me, man.
No. I've really enjoyed this very much.
It's fantastic. And I have a real treat in store for our audience today. And we were talking off air there. A part of the book I absolutely loved, and you loved writing and researching as well. So I'm going to tee you up for this part because this has so many implications. The mental model that it provides for innovation, for learning, for any type of system is just profound. And I learned so much from this. I had another one of those beautiful breakthrough moments when I read about this. So regarding model systems, you say, the big question is how do you realistically and reliably scale up the results and observations of the model system to the real thing. We've discussed that in previous episodes. This entire way of thinking has its origins in a sad failure, and we hinted to this before, in ship design in the middle of the 19th century and the marvelous insights of a modest gentleman engineer into how to avoid it in the future, which brings us to the Great Eastern, the wide gauge railways, and the remarkable Isambard Kingdom Brunel. To set you up here, I'll ask our audience a question, and I've kind of given you the answer. In 2002, the BBC conducted a nationwide poll to select the 100 greatest Britons of all time. Perhaps predictably, many people said Winston Churchill. He came in first. Princess Diana came in third, followed by Charles Darwin in fourth, William Shakespeare, Isaac Newton. Pretty impressive triumvirate. But who came in second is the question. And I've given you the answer there. But at this stage, I'll hand it over to you, Geoffrey.
Yeah, thank you, Aidan. Yeah, no, it's a wonderful story that, yes, this 2002 poll that the BBC did. And by the way, Princess Diana came in third because she had I think she had just died a little bit earlier. I suspect, with all due respect to her, if it were done now, she probably wouldn't be up there quite so high, that's for sure. But number 2 was indeed this extraordinary man with an amazing name, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. If you look him up, anyone looks him up, I'm sure they would show a classic picture of him I think he was quite short, actually. I think he was not much more than about 5 feet. But looking dapper in his top hat and so on, with the chains. The one they usually show are these enormous chains, the links of which almost as big as him, honestly, that the chains to chain the ship that he had built called the Great Eastern to the docks. And the story of the Great Eastern is what you referred to earlier. But let me just say a few words about Brunel. I'd always been, as many Britons are or were, impressed by him because he was considered the greatest engineer of the 19th century. He was sort of the manifestation of the great engineering triumphs coming out of the Industrial Revolution. And he started out, I think, his father was a great engineer. And he worked with his father jointly at age 19 and designed the first tunnel under a navigable river, namely the River Thames, down at Rotherhithe, where the river is quite wide. And they designed this, it was quite a feat. In 18, I don't know, I may have some of my, I haven't reread I haven't reacquainted myself, so I may get some of the details of these stories wrong, I have to say. But it was, I think, by the 1830s, they designed this, the tunnel under the bridge, under the river, and it was I think it was a walking tunnel. I mean, it wasn't traffic walking, and in fact, people were so excited. I think if my memory is correct, they charged for you to walk under it, sixpence or something. And then, and I think they had about 2 million visitors a year. It was a huge attraction. And then it gradually, of course, people lost interest, and then it became the usual problems of tunnels in various places under streets or rivers. All kinds of the dark side of society took over, so to speak. And what is interesting about that tunnel is that eventually they closed it. They closed it to pedestrian traffic, and it was expanded into what became a tunnel for the London Underground to go under the Thames. So anyway, that goes back to when he was 19. And then he's famous for, maybe one of the most famous things that he's known for is he designed the great suspension bridge, the Clifton Bridge over the River Avon in, I guess, Somerset, that he designed. I think he was only about 24, only a few years later, and it was the longest suspension bridge and so on and so forth. And it's wonderful to go look at it, actually.
I was just thinking about that, Geoffrey. Imagine popping into your son, he's 19, and kind of going, "Hey, buddy, what are you up to?" "Oh, just designing a tunnel underneath the Thames."
Exactly.
"All right, I'll see you later." I'll leave you to it. So
he was extraordinarily innovative. And I'll come to the thing that's more relevant for scale and this discussion. But the other thing that he's famous for, that people know him about, is many tunnels and bridges across Britain, probably even in Ireland. I don't know. I should have looked that up. I wouldn't be surprised. But he also made the Great Western Railway. I think he was one of the owners in the end, the best railway in Britain. But it became the best because and this is relevant for scale, actually, this little story, namely, he used wide gauge. And the gauge that was used to construct the railways in early 19th century across Britain, everyone used what is now the standard gauge. I may get this slightly wrong, 4 foot 8 1/4. And why is it that distance? And Brunel was one of the few that thought about it. And here's the amazing thing, and this does have relevance for modern day, namely the reason it was 4 foot 8 1/4 was because that was what had been used in the mines in order to haul coal through the tunnels. But the 4 foot 8 1/4 was the minimum size that you could have a cart horse walk with trucks behind them carrying the coal on rails. So that had defined this arbitrary distance because of the size of a cart horse comfortably. So he was one of the few that said, "Now wait a minute, let's think about this a little bit." And he realized that if you made it almost over 2 feet wider, it had lots of engineering advantages, and in particular, it would stop the swaying of, obviously, if you make it wider, you can make it more robust and so on. So lots of advantages, and the Great Western Railway was, in fact, considered the best railway in the United Kingdom, or in England anyway. And it the original one was the London to Bristol line is Brunel's line, and he built fantastic bridges and so on. And to make that the centerpiece, he built Paddington Station. So if you want to see his work, just go to Paddington. And there you will see built or designed in detail, by the way, by Brunel. So that's great. Now, unfortunately, just to finish that little story, of course, you have eventually, towards the end of the 19th century, you needed to integrate the railway system. And so there was a major commission. And even though I think it agreed that the wide gauge was better, since everybody else had this narrow gauge originating in the width of the backside of cart horses, that was decided. So that permeated not just England, but the United Kingdom, but the world. I think it's true here, right here in New Mexico. I think we have the same gauge for the major lines. Anyway, so, but he was very innovative in this respect and sort of, quote, thinking out of the box. And one of the things that he did in the middle of the 19th century was he was one of the first to realize how crucially important it was to make bigger ships. And he used a scaling argument. He realized it. He realized the following, and it's really using the Galilean argument that I think I talked about in the first episode about the difference between scaling of areas and therefore the strength of a beam versus the weight that it has to hold up, which scales like a volume. And so in that case, in the Galilean argument, as you scale up, the weight scales much faster than the strength holding up that weight. And the system, if you don't change anything, it collapses. So you have to innovate. And that's the primitive origin of innovation. So he had an analogous argument for ships. And what he realized was, obviously, the amount of cargo that you can carry goes like the volume of the ship. But the drag through the sea is the cross-sectional area pushing against the ocean. So what he realized was, if you build bigger ships, so if you double the size of a ship, you could carry 2 times 2 times 2, 8 times as much cargo, but the drag only goes up by a factor of 4, 2 times 2. So per pound or ton of cargo, the bigger you are, the more efficient it is and the cheaper it is to run it. Therefore, build bigger ships. That's why we have these humongous tankers now, because of that fundamentally because of that argument that Brunel realized and said, okay, we got to do it, but we can't do it with wood. We're going to have to build iron ships, which people had already started to do, but we're going to build them big. And he built, the first one was big, but it wasn't hugely bigger than had been built before, he built it called the Great Britain, I think it was called, and it was extremely successful. And by the way, just another side to this about innovation, a lot of this was driven clearly by finance and economics and politics, because Britannia ruled the waves. I hate to say it to an Irishman, but we were.
It's all right, man.
This idea of England and London controlling the world, empire, and all the rest of 19th century.
It's an important point, though, because I just wanted to say, like, Roman roads was why they conquered the world as well, because they could travel and they could conquer and go wide, etc.
So it's quite analogous. So he was driven to some extent, well, to a large extent, in not just in solving a big engineering problem, but by the economics of it. And the sort of, I don't know personally, but the sort of patriotic drive to control the world and have the British Empire, the image of Queen Victoria running everything, kind of. So all the stuff I learned when I was a little boy. And so then and that's a big lead up to the very story that you introduced about the ship called the Great Eastern, because one of the big challenges was communication and getting cargo to and from and exploiting Australia. And that was a big challenge. And he said, okay, I'm going to build a ship that can go from here to Sydney and back, and no Suez Canal, by the way, and do it there and back on one load of coal.
It probably would have got stuck, by the way, Geoffrey, in the Suez Canal. Before you go into that, would you mind if I just wanted to read it, because firstly the broad gauge track story is so important for our audience to understand, because one of the things we talk about is first principles, going back to first principles. And this is what Brunel did so well. He's like going, why are we building on that flawed assumption of the past? Things have changed. We need wider gauges. But then the status quo overpowered him. The standardization of things overpowered him. And despite it being a revolutionary innovation, it got quashed. And I just wanted to say that because you can see how important that was, that decision in the past. And also in organizations, we make decisions based on things that we don't ever reflect and kind of go, let's go back to basics here and build it as if we're building it for today, not based on mindsets of the past. I just wanted to really emphasize that.
Yes, thank you for doing that. And that's very important. And maybe I should have said a couple more words, because one of the things that you realize, and I'm sure people recognize it, we can think of other examples, and especially now in terms of computers. I mean, it drives you nuts, all these different connectors and so on. I mean, there's a small, trivial example of it, that we don't have universal connection, for example, and universal standards and so on, which have been talked about for quite a while, and maybe eventually we will. So there's that side, but there's also the other thing that's interesting about the railway is that once you've made that decision, when you have something so powerful and big and extensive, is that it's fixed. You can't undo it once you've made that particular. Now, these connectors and things we can do, but there are probably other things to do with broadcast and the way we deal with the internet that sort of get, fixed, and they're not optimal. And in fact, some are counterproductive. And we need to think through those things. And you need people like Brunel that sort of think out of the box. And that's what some of the most successful people in Silicon Valley have been able to do, even though they've also been some of the worst, in my opinion, of doing the opposite to that, of forcing us to do things. I mean, I'll get into trouble with this, but like Microsoft Word, I think is a terrible example of getting something that's forced us to do things in a certain way that is highly non-creative and very restrictive. We're probably stuck with it for a very, very long time. Anyway,
well, you know about the QWERTY keyboard. You know that story.
Yeah, the QWERTY keyboard is a fantastic example of that. This ridiculous keyboard that we have, and so on. There's lots of examples like that, and once they're there, that's it. I mean, the QWERTY keyboard is, again, it's sort of like these connectors. It's not terrible. It makes things a little more inefficient and annoying at times. Especially when you're learning, but it's not so bad. But when it's the whole railway system, or presumably there's analogs in the airline system and other kinds of various kinds of transport systems, that once they're done, I mean, I don't know. I've not done any research or an investigation on things like the London Underground. What was the thinking, or was it just what I suspect it was, and the way things were always done? You just sort of, we want to go from here to there, and we just go it, and we don't, rules of thumb, we build it this way, we do that. That's not a big sarcastic.
No, you're right though, because I went to a magnificent exhibition in the Museum of History in London, and there was comments by people working on the tracks today, and they were asked questions like, what would be the one question you'd ask? And they kind of go, well, I wish they'd built it in a way that it could be scaled or developed further.
No, they didn't, of course. And that's the problem. So that, going back now to the Great Eastern and our marvelous Isambard Kingdom Brunel. So he had this vision, which was fantastic. And by the way, he got a lot of pushback on building bigger and bigger ships made of iron, because again, the naive view is that an iron just sinks. It'll just sink if you make it too big. So you have to understand sort of elementary physics and hydrodynamics and so forth. And he did do that. So, but the Great Eastern was conceived to be this ship, as I said, that was going to go to Australia and back. Was the original idea, on one load of coal, and he because there would obviously be problems with that. I mean, problems trying to get efficiently cargo to and from Australia. So he designed a ship that I forget how much bigger. I'm sure I wrote about it in the book, of the order of twice as big as any other ship, twice as long, and in fact, no ship was built bigger than that for at least 50 more years, which is kind of extraordinary. So he made this huge leap, and he built this ship, and this wonderful ship. And I'm going to be slightly cartoonish about it. There it was on the docks, and they had the big opening, and they started the engines. Oh, by the way, I'm sorry, got one other point that he did that was fantastic, was that he also was someone that was a huge proponent of moving away from, of course, sails, which were often used as supplementary power, and paddle wheels, to propellers. Seems sort of obvious, but it was a huge leap, and shaft propellers at the back driving the ship, which is, of course, standard. But so they started up the old propellers, they get the old ship going, and it could barely move. It's not quite true, of course, but it obviously moved, but it was significantly underperforming. It basically could not move very fast, and it was very inefficient. Not only that, it swayed tremendously back and forth relative to ships nowadays, and certainly ships of that time. It was somewhat unstable in that sense. It wasn't unstable, it wasn't going to keel over, but it was unstable. So it had lots of problems. And it came to an ignominious end. I don't think it ever went to Australia, but it did go transatlantic a couple of trips. But it was a total failure in the sense of what it was built for. And it was useful because it was so big, they used it. And so this is a marvelous ending in a funny way. It's sort of repurposing. It was used to lay the first major transatlantic phone line. So, it did come to some use in a very, very significant way, actually. And then eventually it was broken up somewhere towards maybe the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. But one of the things I discovered when I wrote the book, so I knew some of this stuff, but one of the things I discovered when they broke it up, it was roughly at the time, so it must have been the end of the 19th century, it was roughly at the time when Liverpool Football Club was being constituted as a serious entity. And they were looking for some symbol or flagpole or whatever, and they took either the flagpole or the mast from the Great Eastern, and they put it up there at Liverpool at the Cop End. And as of the time I wrote the book, it was still there. So it's kind of wonderful.
Brilliant.
So I have great respect for Liverpool, although I can't stand them as a football team. But that's another story. And by the way, tomorrow is a major day because Tottenham, my team, which is the great burden of my life, are playing Liverpool at Liverpool. And if my memory serves me right, I don't think they've won at Anfield since
the flag was put in.
Roughly speaking, for over 100 years. They've only won about half a dozen times. Even when they were a great team, they have this thing, so it doesn't look good. But anyway, sorry, that's got nothing to do with anything. But it's a nice story that this flagpole ended up, still around today. But anyway, so this was a huge failure, and in every respect, both, of course, economically, but also just in terms of engineering. I mean, this man had been unbelievably successful and innovative, and he tried to do something that was, enormously courageous and exciting, and it had failed. And he was smart enough that he realized that, we better understand what's going on here. And one of the things that became very apparent was that part of the major reason was they actually didn't really know the science of ships, which is sort of amazing when you think about it. The science of ships, shipbuilding, and of hydrodynamics wasn't really understood. And certainly none of it had gone into the planning other than this delightful argument that he used to motivate it of the economy of scale. And one of the things that came out of it was that there was this young man named William Froude, F-R-O-U-D-E, Froude, who had worked for Brunel or Brunel's company on the Great Western Railway, funnily enough. And it might have even worked a little bit on the Great Eastern, I don't know. But Froude was a mathematician, educated at Oxford, and he became very intrigued about this. And at the same time, around that time, the fundamental laws of hydrodynamics were formulated, the so-called Navier-Stokes equations, which formulate the basis of all hydrodynamics, indeed, so much so the basis really of our understanding of weather, as well as, so that's hydrodynamic phenomenon in terms of currents of the ocean and, of course, the currents of the air. So those were formulated around this time, sort of I don't remember the dates, right, 1870 maybe. And Froude, so it was sort of in the air. And Froude said, look, there must be a better way of doing all this. And he realized that what we need to do is, first of all, understand the science, but we need to understand scaling up. And in some ways, he's the modern beginning of the whole idea of scaling and of modeling. The whole idea of modeling something really goes back to William Froude.
What I wanted to really share about this, and why I really think this part of the book is so important, and it's great, it's well written, etc., but it's the lessons you impart through these stories that are so profound and so interesting. And here's one of them. I just wanted to go back to Brunel, and then the building onto Froude, excuse the pun. But you said when systems fails or designs don't meet expectations, there are usually a plethora of reasons that could be the problem. These could include poor planning and execution, faulty workmanship, or materials, poor management, and even a lack of conceptual understanding. However, there are key principles like that of the Great Eastern, where the major reason for failure was that they were designed without a deep understanding of the underlying science and of the basic principles of scale. Indeed, until the last half of the 19th century, neither science nor scale played any significant role in the manufacture of most artifacts, let alone ships. The reason I wanted to share that was it gave me a great thought, because I was thinking about this and I was going, there's this great, you mentioned San Francisco, for example, Silicon Valley, the great words of fail fast and fail quickly. Yes, you can fail yourself forward. That is extremely important. And I'm talking about cultures of innovation here. But you do need to know that there are toolkits and frameworks and mental models and the culture of failing quickly and understanding and moving forwards through failure and iteration, etc. You can't do one or the other. You can, but you'll ultimately come to a Brunel finish with the Great Eastern here. You'll end up maybe as a flagpole in a football club. But that part is so important, because I teach a lot and stuff in organizations on mindset and culture of innovation, and that's the acceptance of failing forward. But I also then go, you need to understand the frameworks, and oftentimes you get resistance because the organization thinks they can do one or the other, but doing both is a recipe for success.
Exactly. Yes, you said it wonderfully. That's exactly right. Exactly right. And I would add to that something that I was going to say after talking a little bit more about Froude, was that, if you, and I'm not sure Froude even realized this, but it becomes very apparent that, if you make a small change, because here's what you have to recognize is that most of the changes in shipbuilding from the very beginnings of primitive boats all the way up, to rowboats, and so on and so forth, all the way up to that time, most of the increments were small, and you learned by trial and error. So if you increase something by a few percent, you increase the size of a ship by 5 or 10%. Well, it probably isn't optimal because you just do rules of thumb. It's all rules of thumb. This is what we did before. You just, add another 5% here, another 5% there. Undoubtedly, it screwed things up a little bit. And then you sort of notice it. You say, oh, yeah, that's right. We should not have increased that bow by the 5%. It should have actually only been 3%. I mean, I'm making up a story here. So you learn, and you sort of had this feedback, and sort of that's how, in a certain sense, natural selection or evolution works. There's these sort of self-correct and so on. So that's fine. And evolution is a large part of evolution is incremental. But if you want to do what Brunel did, an increase by a factor of 2, effectively, and you don't understand how you're supposed to scale up every single piece of this rather complicated and in many ways complex machinery, you are destined, I would say, to screw up. It would be a miracle if you got it right, if you make a huge change. So I think that's one of the lessons that comes out of it, is that incrementalism can work and you can self-correct if you have the time and energy and money. But major changes, and indeed major innovations, often, they may innovate, but you also have to be prepared for these kinds of phenomena that Brunel ran into. You
made a really important point as well that you alluded to it. Brunel's ambition to conquer and bring the English everywhere, United Kingdom everywhere, was driving. So it was financial reward. Equally, that's what happened here. There was a pressure on him to overperform. So he tried to jump evolution without the science. And that's what happens in organizations when the board come down, a CEO comes down and go, we need to be more innovative, we need to innovate. And the organization hasn't been trained on how to do that. And then things break down.
You're absolutely right. I mean, so on the one hand, one of the problems with most organizations is that they don't innovate, that we clearly need, you need to be continually innovating, but you need to be prepared for innovation. You need to have people both educated and have the culture that can take advantage of major innovations. So I think that's a crucial lesson to learn. It's not, you need to have all of the above, so to speak. So, and in fact, one of the great things that Froude did, of course, was to recognize that, look, what we should be doing is first of all understanding the fundamental science of ships moving or objects moving through water. And he had this idea he realized that it had been a scaling problem. And then he took what was an enormous leap, an extraordinary insight, which seems sort of obvious now. Well, what we should do is build a scale model of the ship, this big, size of my desk, and put it in a big water tub and watch what happens. Well, that's the core of the idea, and then scale up. But that's the problem. How do you scale up? What is it? It's not, again, linear. So it's the equation, so to speak, the underlying science that then tells you, if you watch what happens, on the size of this room, for a ship moving. It tells you how to scale up what you see there and measure to something that's hundreds of feet long in the ocean. And by the way, you can also simulate waves, of course. It's not just moving through water. You can simulate waves and so on. So he invented the whole idea of having these tanks and so on. And by the way, he was much poo-pooed when he did this. And in fact, the sort of the leading naval engineering architect of the time, whose name I'm afraid I have forgotten, who was head of the Society of Naval Architects. John Russell, exactly. Who had actually been, I think, a partner earlier on with Brunel, thought this was a stupid idea. This is sort of like kids playing, in a pool kind of thing, and didn't really appreciate the science. And of course, when it proved, it's one of those cases when it proved to be powerful and correct. And of course, by the way, that's how everything now is done, basically, in some form or another. He, of course, said, "Oh, yes, of course, I had that idea. I was the person that invented, etc." One of those people.
I know you're very humble, but you write brilliantly, and there's a couple of quotes here that just bring it all together beautifully. And it's so this sounds great when you're telling the stories, and then I can share these quotes. It's not to get my voice in there, just to say.
Oh, it's wonderful. Go ahead, please, because I forgot what I wrote.
Of course. Well, it's been a while. So you said studying turbulence gave us the first important mathematical insights into the concept of complexity and its relationship to nonlinearity. Complex systems often manifest chaotic behavior in which a small change or perturbation in one part of the system produces an exponentially enhanced response in some other part. As we discussed earlier, in traditional linear thinking, a small perturbation produces a commensurately small response. The highly non-intuitive enhancement in nonlinear systems is popularly expressed, as we talked before, as the butterfly effect, in which the mythical flapping of a butterfly's wings in Brazil produces a hurricane in Florida. Despite years of intense theoretical and experimental study, a general understanding of turbulence remains an unsolved problem in physics, even when we have learned an enormous amount about it. Indeed, the famous physicist Richard Feynman described turbulence as the most important unsolved problem of classical physics. And you tell us William Froude may not have fully recognized just how big a challenge he was facing, but he did perceive that for applications to shipbuilding, a new strategy was needed. It was in this context that he invented the new methodology of modeling, and by extension the concept of scaling theory for determining how quantitative results from small-scale investigations could be used to help predict how full-size ships would behave. In the spirit of Galileo, Froude realized that almost all scaling is nonlinear, so traditional models based on the fateful one-by-one representation were not useful for determining how figuring out to scale from small sizes would scale up to full-size objects. And I just wanted to share that because that brings everything together and hopefully makes sense to our audience that's all the stuff we've talked about before. And even the science of complexity that you and the brilliant Santa Fe Institute bring to life are so important to understand both innovation, how things evolve, but also ultimately the future of the planet that we're going to talk about in the next episode.
I think a large part of the problem is that there's several aspects in terms of being perceived by, say, non-scientists, is that, first of all, in our sort of normal day-to-day world, we tend to think linearly. We tend to think incrementally, and what happened yesterday is sort of like today. They used to say, by the way, in the old days, before we had all these marvelous ways of predicting weather, you could do just as well by saying today's weather is going to be like yesterday's, and you would do just as well. It was that kind of thinking that permeated permeates much of our sort of normal daily life. That's one thing. So nonlinearity is very hard to perceive somehow, even though it's sort of obvious in our, in our personal relations, after all. We certainly see it, the way we interact with each other and so forth is highly nonlinear. And indeed, even analogues to chaotic phenomenon, some small effect can destroy a marriage. I mean, I don't want to be, but, can have very profound effects. But something that seems small seems bigger, yet we don't sort of think in those terms somehow. Our brain likes to think in incremental short periods or short distances and in a linear fashion. But much of the world, and the world we've been talking about, is highly nonlinear, as you reminded us from that quote. And the other thing that we're very bad at is understanding exponential, even though it's used colloquially, and that many of these things have exponential consequences, and that sometimes that can be thought of as good, because if I invest, in $1 today and it grows exponentially, I'm a very rich man rather quickly. And in fact, all the rich investors in the world have benefited from that trivial sort of mathematical observation. But in other things, it can be quite disastrous, because you quickly run into something that's unsustainable, and that's part of the issue that we're facing in terms of the future of the planet. We have been expanding exponentially, willy-nilly. In fact, it's built in to our whole socioeconomic paradigm that began with the Industrial Revolution, and the discovery of entrepreneurism and capitalism and free markets, which have been so enormously successful and fantastic. But they've led to this sort of integration into it of open-ended exponential growth without consequences. And that's the piece that has been missing, is to not recognize that at some stage you may run into big problems. And in fact, I believe quite strongly we are running into big problems. And many of the problems we're facing today are the leading edge of these consequences of this dynamic that has propelled us to this extraordinary standard and quality of life.
The picture I see in my head is an unfortunate game of musical chairs where the chairs are running out, and equally we see that with the size of the planet, or the population of the planet, and it's not so much just enough food and water to provide for those people. It's pensions, because if people are living for longer and still retiring, you're like, how will I provide going forward and stuff like that? These are all questions that I certainly don't have faith in governments that they're thinking about that, because they're, as we talked about, they're being measured on short term and thinking about the next voting round rather than thinking actually long term.
Yes, that's I think in the end, I've concluded that in some ways, maybe the major challenge, and certainly one of the truly major challenges, is the tension between the time scales of political action, or how should I say it, of the political process versus the time scales of the trying to solve these problems. Because to deal with these problems requires, thinking in terms of 5, 10, 20, 50 years, maybe 100 years. And the political processes, I use the phrase, 2 years is infinity. You have to think about the next election, whatever, and you want to solve immediate problems very quickly in order to get elected or re-elected. So, and those two things are in tension between them. And added to that, we don't have much time. We can't just sort of wait around and hope that we can solve that kind of social problem, if you like, that, we change the political system. That ain't going to happen. And if it were to happen, it might take 100 years. by then, terrible things might have happened. The problem that is outside of science, by the way. So that's one of my own personal frustrations, is that, some of us working and thinking about this can provide conceptual frameworks and the thinking and the background science, and even do the detailed analyses, which many people do, of these various phenomena that contribute to sustainability, climate change, and sustainability of markets, and so on, all these various big questions, and even the one that you just raised, which is crucial, just making sure that as people live longer, we can support them. All these various things, which are long-term issues, we can supply, I think we can come to terms with all that, but in the end, the solution is going to be political action by politicians who are in power. And, we don't see much evidence of that. And again, partly that's because the political systems we have evolved, as I say, 2 years is infinity. It's a horrible kind of thought, but, in some ways, a benevolent dictator who will be there for the next 25 years, a benevolent dictator, which is an oxymoron, presumably, and mostly anyway, is maybe the right way to do it. Someone, which I hate. I mean, that just goes against our, it's, I don't say that is the solution, but it just brings up that issue, put it slightly differently and less provocatively, to what extent can democracy, however it is expressed, solve this problem? The way democracy has evolved in most places across the planet. And by the way, just a total speculation, it could well be that we're seeing the rise of authoritarianism in some curious way, because there is some kind of collective intuition that democracy can't solve these problems, and we need some strong leader like Donald Trump, or, well, the Russians have always had some version of that, like Putin, but we see it in India, Modi, and Orbán in Hungary. But people searching for I'm a couch. What is it? A couch psychologist that looking for father to solve the problem. Dad knows everything. Surely he can solve this. So let's find a big daddy that can do it. I mean, I'm being, again, sarcastic and cartoonish, but, I wonder about that. That's total speculation, but it is that, in the end, it's political action. We can do all the science. We inform. We do our best. There needs to be more of it. There isn't. We still need much more, but nevertheless, we could solve it, I think. We could come to terms with this, but unless there's action and recognition, I mean, we can hardly get recognition of climate change. I mean, we have, across many parts of the world, people have come to terms with it to some extent, or at least to dealing with it. In this country, the United States, it's a continuous battle, and it's, we do some, but it's diddly on the scale of what needs to be done. So, and that's just one problem, by the way. I mean, climate change, despite the fact that it plays center stage in many of these discussions, is really just one of many problems. And in fact, I'm slightly concerned that it plays too much center stage. It's not, I mean, in the sense that we tend to then forget about all these other issues. And if you believe, if you understand to some extent complex adaptive systems, you realize they're all interconnected. So you better attack them all.
It's so important, and for our audience who are interested in that's going to be the focus of part 4, and Geoffrey's kindly agreed to come back for part 4, and we'll talk about the planet and scaling and how it affects the planet. One of the things that just jumped to mind there was how, we talked about aging, we talked about the amazing advances that humankind has made on aging, and that for every year that passes by, we're adding on a year in the longevity of humankind, or more perhaps. But you're kind of going, for what though? Because we're ruining the planet, and that's kind of the way you got to think about everything in unison. That they're all interconnected as well. And the other thing I thought about, I think we mentioned it before, but there's a brilliant show on Netflix called "Don't Look Up" about the comet coming for Earth.
Yes, there was that with DiCaprio, yes,
and Jennifer Lawrence,
yeah, and that's, yes, that was.
Did you see it?
Yes, I did see it.
Well, that reminds me of, DiCaprio plays, we're not ruining for here, no spoiler, but there's a comet heading for Earth. DiCaprio discovers it and tells everyone, and then he becomes like this media star, and they make it into this whole kind of media tour, and then they try and mine the comet rather than destroy it, and it's too late, and it's literally about climate changes.
Exactly. It was a brilliant sort of metaphor for exactly the kind of thing I sort of stumbled through trying to describe, of this relationship between sort of science and what science tries to do and to inform policy, create new knowledge, create new ways of thinking, and to attack some of these big questions. And the way when it's supplied to the politicians and the policymakers and some of the practitioners, it gets perverted. And perverted both in that's what was so brilliant about that. Perverted, boy, maybe we can exploit this. First of all, that's one of the first things, is the idea of exploitation. And then, sort of subverting the whole idea that the planet is going to come to an end into just a show. It's not even, we don't really take this seriously, and that's sort of what's happened. And so I thought it was very brilliant, actually, that take it out of the context of, some of these big questions, and especially climate change, and put it into something that's that isn't going to happen, actually, namely, an asteroid. I mean, it's exceedingly unlikely, I think. An asteroid's going to come, that's coming, and is going to be here in a few months and destroy the planet. That's exceedingly unlikely, I would say. But to use that, I thought, was very clever as a threat to the planet, because even though an asteroid is not out there on its way to the planet, metaphorically it is. I mean, metaphorically we are. There is a great big bloody asteroid heading, and it's going to be here in, 10, 20, 30 years, and it's going to potentially, well, I'll use the word destroy in quotes. It's going to have profound effects. And
we don't even know. We
have no idea. I don't know, I mean, I've speculated that it goes everywhere from, just, returning us to hunter-gatherers to, but I think more than that, I mean, just to jump ahead, and we'll talk about this next time, and it's total speculation, because next time I want to about the science part of this, and the conceptual framework for it. But what will happen, of course, before this happens, Armageddon strike, so to speak, we'll just get more and more social unrest, and more sort of craziness, and more disease, all kinds of things like that. The sort of dark side of what we've created, and what that will lead to, I don't know. It may be that in the end, the destruction comes, and it's sort of interesting watching Ukraine, that we're, in the background there's this talk about, will Putin use a nuclear weapon? I mean, it's sort of unbelievable to think that, I mean, on the scale of the problems of the planet, that Putin would want to get, what it's like? I hate to say this to it, I'll probably get killed for this. It's sort of like the British, or the English, not the British, the English saying, Ireland's always been part of England. We've always been it. Okay, we're coming back. We're taking over. You buggers. Why are you? You're part of England. You've always been since Edward the whatever, Edward II or whatever it was.
We'd love to have Boris as our leader.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, it's sort of like that. And we'd send troops over. I mean, it's sort of like, it's like, have we gone totally mad? And that that's mad of itself, but it's mad in terms of the problems we're facing on the planet.
Priorities.
Talk about, it's like, it's just incredible that we have to turn our attention to this, and that it's blown up. I mean, it's an unfortunate choice of words, but it's expanded into even, sort of there in the background, and these discussions, will he use nuclear weapons? And it's a fascinating question, of course, horrible. Yeah. But it shouldn't be there. None of this, we have these other, we have the
real problems,
problems.
Other than ego.
The ego, yes. It would be like Boris Johnson, I say, just going back to that, like he did, or the right wing in England that, deciding that the Irish are actually part of of England, of the United Kingdom.
If you're okay with this, I thought I'd bring it back to Freud, and then we'd finish on that, because the train of thought we're on there, and then we'll come to the planet the next day. And what I'm thinking here is that, just like you said, 2 years is infinity. And if everybody takes that as a mental model, like the politician trying to get elected again and dealing with short-term problems because that's what they're most measured on, that's what happens in organizations as well. A leader gets elected, essentially gets brought in, new board, we want you to change the place. And it's like, how can I make incremental changes that are most visible first, rather than transformational big jump, evolutionary jumps, and I won't get measured on. And the reason I bring that up is those type of leaders, as JFK wrote in his Profiles of Courage book, are not very successful. It's like almost, it never really ends well for a whistleblower. People who do the right thing don't always get celebrated that way. And this is why I loved Freud, because you said here, and I love this, and it will speak to our audience so much, Geoffrey. There's a paragraph I'd love you to comment on, and I know it will absolutely please our audience, because you say of Freud here, who's battling the status quo, like many new ideas that threaten to change the way we think about an old problem, Freud's endeavours were at first dismissed as irrelevant by the cognoscenti of the time. John Russell, who we mentioned, who founded the Institution for Naval Architects in London in England in 1860 in order to encourage the formal education of ship designers, ridiculed Freud, saying, "You will have on the small scale a series of beautiful and interesting little experiments which I am sure will afford," terrible accent, "will afford Mr. Freud infinite pleasure in the making of them, and will afford you infinite pleasure in the hearing of them, but which are quite remote from any practical results upon the large scale." And many of us, as you say, recognize this kind of rhetoric, often aimed at scholarly or academic research, with the implication that it is out of touch with the real world. Well, no doubt much of it is, but much of it isn't. And more to the point, it is very often difficult to perceive in the moment the potential impact of some piece of seemingly arcane research. Much of our entire technologically driven society and extraordinary quality of life that many of us are privileged to enjoy is the result of such research. There is a continuing tension in society between supporting what is perceived as pie-in-the-sky basic research with no obvious immediate benefit versus highly directed research focused on useful real-world problems. But I love that quote, and I picked that specifically because I thought that speaks to, and you couldn't have done a better job of teeing that up, but it actually brings it all together beautifully.
Well, thank you for quoting. I'd forgotten that. I'm embarrassed to say. Of course, I think that way all the time, but I'd forgotten I'd written it. So it was quite good, actually, I have to admit.
Bravo, sir, bravo.
So I'll take that. But it is true. No, I mean, just to bring it back to what we were discussing, it is absolutely true how difficult it is to get new ideas accepted. And Freud's case is a fantastic example, especially that case, because it completely changed the way, we think about things. We do engineering and so on. I mean, making models is sort of just taken for granted. And there's also, the other thing that's interesting about this is that you just assume people have always done that. You don't realize it only goes back, well, now 150 years at most. People didn't think that way. This was a whole new way, a whole new paradigm for thinking about design and innovation and moving ahead. And it involves the idea of scale. And scale. So scale and model are, they're not quite synonymous, but they're quite intertwined. And it goes back to Mr. Froud.
And it goes back to also what we were talking about earlier. You need the science and you need the experience. You need both of those working in parallel, speaking to each other. Hence why we talked about the last day. We need to solve complex problems. We need complex teams. We need people outside their swim lanes, swimming together in the same direction, working towards the same goal.
And by the way, I have to, we're always complaining that we don't get enough funding, and I think that's certainly true. But you have to. I always say, you have to look on the other side. It is fantastic that governments do support basic research. I mean, they do. There is a recognition somewhere that some is, but I have to tell you, one of the great changes that has taken place during my career, and especially in the last 20 years, is that propensity, which is expressed in that paragraph. The governments say, well, yeah, okay, we should be supporting some, pie in the sky, basic research and so on. But really, what we really want to support is how does it affect this problem, and tell us about, solving this problem and so on. And they invent all kinds of fancy terms to do that you're supposed to write about in your proposal. The idea, which was sort of rampant post-war, maybe probably pre-war, but in a way was a child of the Manhattan Project, ironically, was of course, first of all, the recognition that science can have profound implications for so-called practical problems, in that case, a horrible one, creating an atomic bomb, but came from the most arcane science, fundamental physics, atomic and nuclear physics. So that led to the idea that was sort of in the background of the support by federal agencies of science: find the smartest people, give them the money, and let them get on with it, which, sounds highly entitled. But in fact, that has been an amazing formula. And society can't sustain that. There's always that feeling, these guys are doing stuff that's sort of irrelevant, and who cares? So who cared about atoms? And who cared about, nuclei and so on? And who cares about, one of the best examples, I'll tell you one anecdote. So when I was a graduate student, I knew I wanted to become a theoretical physicist, but I recognized also, I felt very strongly that physics is fundamentally an experimental science, and you really has to be driven by experiment, observation, and the interplay between theory, modeling, and experiment. So I worked at the beginning with a marvelous man named Arthur Schawlow, who eventually got the Nobel Prize for jointly discovering, with his brother-in-law, actually, Charlie Towns, the laser. And I worked with him on one of the earliest lasers, and this is at Stanford. And we were doing a sort of atomic physics with it and so on. And there was this fantastic beam, And one evening, he was often in the lab there, and I'd said to him, Art, we were discussing this whole question, the practicality of science. And he'd come from Bell Labs, by the way, so he was very familiar with this, and we were discussing it. And I was arguing for, free and easy and so on. So I said, well, actually, here we're doing this stuff, this basic research. What use is this? This laser. And he said, oh, this is going to have a huge effect. This is going to be really profound. I said, really? Like what? He said, well, so when we had visitors to the lab, we would take a little block of wood, about this big, maybe 2 inches square, and we put it on a little tripod, and then we'd shoot the laser beam, and it would drill a little hole through it, and we'd always show that people, it was great to see in those days. And he would say, well, this little demonstration we do, that's going to revolutionize the planet because we will be able to cut steel to any accuracy, basically. And that's going to revolutionize the planet. Well, he got it completely wrong. It didn't. That's not what revolutionized the planet with his bloody laser. The laser revolutionized the planet in doing what we're doing now. It was part of the input to the IT revolution, and all the digital stuff is the laser. It did revolutionize the planet, but not in the way even Art Shallow, the inventor, could conceive. So it's a fantastic story, I think, of, not just even the scientists. Even when you do the science, you don't know where it's going to lead. And society does need to varying degrees, support people doing this kind of work, and it will have an impact. Everything in the end, to varying degrees, will have an impact, hopefully for good, sometimes for bad.
Beautiful way to finish. Let's finish it on that, man. That's a nice upbeat way to think about it. And I really, really am so appreciative of your time. I know our audience are getting so much great feedback. I'm getting unbelievable feedback about these episodes, Geoffrey. Good. So I'm glad to pass.
Talking with you, Aidan. First of all, I have to say this sounds hokey in your head. I do like to, I'm one of those admirers of Irish accents and the Irish. I hate to say that. It's even.
I don't even think I have one.
That's patronizing. I know.
Not at all. Well, I actually don't even think I have one, which is funny. You should hear my father's accent.
Yeah. Anyway, no, I enjoy that very much.
Pleasure, man. Absolute pleasure. And I'll do a sign off now. And don't forget, people, I just keep saying to everybody I meet, you got to buy a copy of this book. It's so valuable. It creates so many aha moments and just analogies and metaphors that you can kind of go, oh, well, that's just like this. And you have those kind of beautiful moments throughout the book, which I just wanted to pass on to you as well, because it's so useful to hear that, I think, as well. It's refreshing to hear those things, I think.
You should have been my publicity agent.
Well, it's a brilliant book. I love it. And I'm so looking forward to a really important issue, which is part 4, author of Scale, the Universal Laws of Life and Death in Organisms, Cities and Companies. Geoffrey West, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Aidan. Lovely. We'll look forward to next time.
I want to thank our sponsor, Xi. Xi is boldly transforming the future of financial services with a suite of embedded finance products and services, empowering businesses to manage multiple payment workflows and to move funds with ease. You can check out Xi at helloxi.com, and I'll see you next week.